got through January. I want to acknowledge that. Yes, February 1st feels good. Welcome to the launch of the final report of the Affordability Action Council. Bienvenue au lancement du rapport final du Conseil d'action sur l'abordabilité. My name is Jennifer Ditchburn, and I'm the president and CEO of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. We're one of the founding partner organizations of the Council, along with the McConnell Foundation, the Trottier Family Foundation, and Destination Zero. Avant de commencer, je tiens à souligner que nous sommes réunis aujourd'hui sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin-anishinaabe. Nous reconnaissons que le peuple anishinaabe sont les gardiens de ces terres et de ces eaux depuis des temps immémoriaux. Nous honorons le lien durable qui les unit à ces terres. As we're talking about food and housing and energy and transportation affordability, it's important to note that Indigenous people on and off reserve are experiencing these challenges much more profoundly. As just one example, 34% of Indigenous families experience food insecurity as compared to 18% of non-Indigenous families. Indigenous people have been facing a housing crisis in Canada for decades longer. 130,000 homes are needed on reserve over the next 10 years, according to research by the Assembly of First Nations. So we have to recognize as policy people, and there are a lot of policy people in the room, that Indigenous people what they face can be directly linked to bad policy choices of the past, or to be more blunt, ones that were deliberately trying to diminish, sideline, or even erase Indigenous communities. And we have to do better and do policy in a good way. The Affordability Action Council was created with the intention of bringing together a wide range of experts and points of view. So I'm really encouraged to see this great mix of people in the room from across sectors, across party lines, across areas of work. I'd like to introduce Peter Fragiskatos, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, and a Member of Parliament for London North Centre, to say a few words. Peter.
Jennifer, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for being here today and the critical work that you've done, which certainly informs government policy. We need to be in touch with experts, with all the policy wonks, and it's not a bad word. It's a very good word. It's a very good concept, and truly appreciate what you do. I am here on behalf of our Housing Minister and Minister responsible for infrastructure, of course, the Honourable Sean Fraser, who couldn't be here, but certainly will be following and has followed the work of the Council, and that will continue. As far as the first focus on housing, and I know there's an interplay obviously between housing and climate change, but on the housing side, we are in a housing crisis. I think that is something that we have to face as a government, but as a country as well. And we begin by recognizing that there's so many different things underpinning it, but at the core of that is the crisis in supply. The housing crisis that we have is fundamentally a supply crisis, and recognizing that, the government has introduced a number of programs to meet the moment. This includes the Apartment Construction Loan Program, whereby low-interest loans are provided to builders so that more homes can be built. And just this week, this expanded, you would have seen. I know that some of you have a university background, certainly Western's represented here on my end, but Carleton and Ottawa, you might be in the room, and other schools. Post-secondary institutions writ large, this includes colleges, can now apply to this particular program, again, to access those low-interest loans so more homes can be built for students in that case, ideally on campus. We have removed GST from the construction of apartments, and already we've heard from the private sector that thousands of more units will be built. There's a Dream Unlimited, a developer in Toronto, on its own says that just this one change will incent such a monumental shift that on its estimates now, it's believed that this will lead to 10,000 additional units being constructed because of that. There is the Housing Accelerator Fund, or the HAF. This, as you've seen in recent months, led to many agreements with municipalities across the country. 30 agreements have been signed thus far between the federal government and various cities. In this case, it began in my hometown of London with a $74 million investment, but we see many different municipalities signing on, and that's expected to continue. 30 agreements thus far, but there's over 500 municipalities, large and small, urban and rural, across the country that have expressed an interest in signing on. And in return for federal dollars, which are substantive, this is a $4 billion federal program after all, there are changes that are expected to be introduced at the local level. Very important zoning changes that encourage, among other things, the kind of densification that the council has called for in the past. As a result, we expect to see more duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, mid-rise apartments, row houses even. All of that will come as a result of the Housing Accelerator Fund, and no less than 500,000 homes will be built in the coming decade as a result of this particular policy. That is the estimate. Finally, on housing, I'd be very remiss and disrespectful, frankly, if I didn't talk about homelessness. As a result of the National Housing Strategy, we have seen around 70,000 individuals, members of our fellow citizens, members of Canadian communities throughout, large and small, lifted off the streets. Or if they haven't been taken off the streets entirely, then certainly they were very close to homelessness, and now they are housed, not just with a roof over their head, but in fact with the type of wraparound supports that are so critical to ensuring a transition to something much more positive. This includes on-site mental health services, on-site primary health care services writ large, job training programs, and other supports that are so fundamental in ensuring a positive transition. And in that, we work with not-for-profit organizations, which I can't say enough about what they contribute. I've talked about the private sector and incentives we've put on the table for them, but this requires a full-scale kind of a response where governments have to work together, and certainly there's disagreements from time to time between municipal governments and provincial governments, between us and them. But on something like housing and infrastructure as well, we have to find ways to ensure that a nonpartisan approach is taken, but it includes bringing other players to the table to ensure success, private sector and the not-for-profit sector as well. On climate change, the challenge of our time, I think it's fair to say. Retrofitting of buildings, and we know how important that is. All of you know that very well, but I think this is something that the population is coming to see and understand and take advantage of. There are programs in place now, either through loans or grants, that allow for the retrofit of buildings, which is clearly very critical, in addition to, I mean, it ranks number 3 on the list when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, oil and gas, followed by transportation, and then, of course, buildings that really are, well, they need to be a focus. That includes buildings like the ones that you see every day on our streets, but also homes. So those, the access of individuals to loans and grants to retrofit is very important. And what we also hear from citizens is the need for disaster mitigation and adaptation. And so the funding that is available through Environment and Climate Change Canada for programs that would see fire breaks put in place, dikes, berms, all of this is clearly very crucial. Every summer we see, in particular, stories that are impacting Canadians across. There isn't a community that hasn't been impacted, is what I'm trying to say. We have, you know, it's the story of our time in so many different ways. And so mitigating disaster as a result of climate change is something that you can continue to see the government act upon. Continued support for public transit. I know this has been a real focus of the council, and I echo that. This is something that we need to continue with, not just a focus on public transit, though, but it includes electrification of transit. Municipalities want to move in this direction, and the federal government will be there to help. And finally, we're committing, rather, to the establishment of a national flood insurance program. This is something that has been called for, and it's something that is squarely on the eye of government. We do want to ensure that this does come together for all the reasons that I've outlined. And so thank you once again for your time. I do look forward to listening to the panel discussion. I don't think I can stay for all of it. I'm going to slated to stay at 12:30, but I know this is going to be a very interesting discussion, so I'm going to find a way to stay a little longer. But if you do see me sneak out, it's just because of prior commitments that I've already committed to. In any case, thank you very much, and on behalf of Minister Fraser, we look forward to this particular report and the recommendations to follow. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for those remarks. Peter's portfolio and the files that ministers and opposition critics follow are often associated with very specific policy areas. And our governments organize their work into, pretty defined, I think we can all agree, kind of artificial categories. And our governments, we can admit, aren't always great at working horizontally. But all of us are acutely aware that all the policy challenges that we're facing today, and they're serious ones, can't be dealt with in isolation. Donc, lorsque nous parlons de logement, d'immigration, l'accès à la nourriture ou la lutte contre le changement climatique, la première étape consiste à reconnaître qu'ils sont tous liés. They're all intertwined. That's why this particular initiative is trying to take an all-in systems approach, taking a wide lens, and see how we might tackle more than one challenge at a time. Above all, we don't want to recommend policy changes that are going to create another problem down the line that we didn't anticipate from the outset. And you'll see the symbol for the council, I think, is a great one because it shows how, it kind of encompasses how policy is all interconnected. It's often also the most vulnerable that bear the brunt of affordability and climate crises. And so, for example, it's the poorest Canadians that are experiencing rising food prices and the effects of wildfires. That's why the Council chose to focus its recommendations on solutions for low and moderate income households. And for those Canadians, we're just talking about survival in this day and age. L'autre élément clé que je voudrais souligner à propos de cette initiative est l'esprit de collaboration qui la caractérise. This has been a nonpartisan endeavor with many different kinds of organizations and experts behind it. And finding our common ground was not always easy. I see some of the experts that were involved here today. But Canada's facing enormous challenges. And it's my conviction, and I know conviction of many in this space, that we need to bring our power together and work together to find solutions. So I want to salute the Trottier Family Foundation, the McConnell Foundation, for their collaborative vision and for supporting the work of the Affordability Action Council. So I'll now introduce our expert panel, who have been waiting here very patiently. You'll find their full bios on the event website. Yasmin Abraham is president and co-founder of the Cambo Energy Group, a social enterprise that reduces energy poverty and improves housing in communities that have been historically under-prioritized. Lisa Ray, in the middle, is the Director of System Change at Prosper Canada and is responsible for advancing policy and advocacy efforts. And Nate Wallace is the Clean Transportation Program Manager at Environmental Defense. In this position, he works on decarbonizing the transportation sector with a particular focus on electrifying light-duty vehicles, expanding public and active transportation options, and building more sustainable and inclusive cities. So welcome. Nice to see you. Thank you. I'm just going to change positions here. So just to start us off, I wanted to ground the conversation a little bit. Obviously, when we're talking about all these policy challenges around affordability, we're talking about people, and people who are living, some very challenging realities right now. So I wanted to ask each of you, you deal with different but overlapping constituencies. What are you hearing or seeing in terms of the challenges of the people that you connect with in your work? Yasmin, I'm going to start with you because it's easiest. Right next to
fair
me.
enough. Yes, hi, and thanks for the question. Nice to be here. Cambo Energy Group is a family-run social enterprise. We are second generation certified minority-owned business, and we have been doing this work for 15 years. Our work reduces energy poverty and improves housing, specifically in vulnerable communities. We've worked with tens of thousands of communities over the 15 years, working with First Nations communities, immigrants, newcomers, and lower income households. So all of our recommendations and insights coming from, on the ground, community-based approaches. What we are really seeing and hearing when it comes to climate and affordability are things like, folks who were opening their windows to cool down their home. Now they can't do that because it's too hot and it's not working, or there's wildfire smoke out there. And so now they're looking at cooling mechanisms to cool their home. Folks we work with, we hear about how housing is so unaffordable right now that they have to stay in their homes. And so they're looking at ways to make their home more efficient, more resilient for the future. A lot of folks who previously could absorb the cost of their energy costs, in the last few years, a lot of these bills have doubled and even tripled. And I wish I was exaggerating, but I'm really not. And so for those folks, things become really tough. You have to make some really hard choices. And if anybody in this room has been in that position where you don't know how you're going to pay a bill, you know how that feels. And if you've never been in that position, then consider yourselves very privileged. But a lot of these folks, they make the decision of whether to heat or eat, right? Food is the one place where you can change your spending. So they're going to food banks, they're eating less, they're changing how much they spend at the grocery store. A lot of folks are making the choices of which bill should I go into arrears. Should I pay my rent? Do I have a good relationship with my landlord? Are they going to be upset? Or should I not pay my utility bill and get my electricity turned off? Things like payday loans, those predatory financial tools, those are a lifeline for a lot of people. And it's not a great financial choice, but strong financial choices are also a privilege. When you are trying to get food on your table and you are trying to keep your kids warm, you're not thinking about the interest rate of that loan. You are getting that money to pay your bill. And the last thing I'll say is around the real health impacts of energy poverty. Energy poverty has been studied for decades. There's pulmonary and respiratory impacts of not being able to heat or cool your home. And we saw that so acutely in British Columbia in 2021 with the heat dome, where 600 people died in their homes because they could not keep their home cool. And those were vulnerable folks, and those are preventable deaths. So, being in energy poverty is so much more than just a high bill. It has real impacts on folks. So, the work that we do is hard, it's good, but there's so much more to be done.
Thank you. Lisa?
Thanks, Jennifer. And we're seeing a lot of the same things on the ground through our partners. Prosper Canada is a national charity that works on policy and program interventions for people living in poverty. And we do that primarily through a national network of partners that provides largely multi-service community organizations that provides a variety of different social services and some that specialize in financial health, money management. All of our partners support people with low incomes, people with moderate incomes to help file their taxes, which is really the way that a lot of people access the income security system, as well as apply for other benefits through provinces, through municipalities. And through that work, Prosper Canada and our partners, we have helped over 1 million people access $1.26 billion in benefits that they were eligible for and otherwise not receiving. But what we are now seeing on the ground, one is just an increase in demand for those services and that support. We're seeing people coming in with more complex and urgent financial issues and crises and overlapping crises and the kinds of challenges and trade-offs that you were speaking about. And we're also seeing that even when we're able to help people to maximize their incomes through access to all of the benefits and support that they're eligible for, that they just aren't going far enough and that people are still really struggling to make ends meet.
Thank you. Nate?
So I guess I'll start with what might be a bit of a shocking statistic. Since 2019, the price of a used car has gone up by about 110%. The price of a new car has gone up by about 70%. In 2019, you could buy a used car for about $19,000, and now it's $40,000. That's, the used car market is where most low and middle income families make their vehicle purchases. So, we've seen an explosion of, car-related debt. and with interest rates also affecting the payments for that, they're up by 20 to 30% since the pandemic. And at the same time, we've also seen housing costs skyrocket in cities, so that we're seeing tons of people moving further and further out from cities. So we've seen this, essentially this suburbanization of transport poverty, because they're moving to areas with poor transit service. So people are really stuck between a rock and a hard place, choosing between high transport costs and slightly lower housing costs, and vice versa. So at the same time, we've also seen transit systems struggling financially because of the pandemic. Because I remember in 2020, within 1 month, you had transit ridership drop by about 80%. And just to put that into context, for every 10% that transit ridership goes down at the national level, transit systems collectively lose about $470 million that they use to keep the lights on, to pay for service, to keep bus drivers on the payroll. And thankfully, there was a significant financial assistance from the federal government and from provincial governments in 2020 and 2021, which kept the lights on, kept systems from completely collapsing. I don't think I can actually make it enough of a point that if that hadn't happened, systems would be completely unrecognizable today. But now that support has been cut off, while we're at about 80% of recovery, so we're getting back into this cycle of having those costs being passed back on to riders in service cuts and fare hikes, when we're talking about folks who are most reliant on transit, disproportionately low income. There's another statistic where, according to the latest census, we've got about a quarter of Canadians in the labor force are racialized, but over half of people who use transit to get to work are racialized. So it's disproportionately impacting racialized folks as well. So those are the two kind of big drivers right now in the transport space, where we really need to be addressing both sides of the equation of the high housing costs, obviously, but also high transport costs.
Thank you. You three of you painted a great, well, not a great picture, but a clear picture. I just want to share some numbers. The most recent numbers from StatsCan show that 7 million people in Canada, 2 million of them children, are facing food insecurity. And if you dig a little deeper, the numbers, some of the disaggregated numbers are bleak as well. 40% of families led by single mothers are living in food insecurity. 60% of families led by single mothers with disability, 60%. And more than 1/3 of Black and Indigenous families are food insecure. Lisa, one of the recommendations of the council is to create something called a groceries and essentials benefit. Can you tell us what that is and how it would work?
Yeah, absolutely. And those numbers and the starkness of that reality is really the motivation for thinking about, what is something relatively quick, relatively easy that the federal government could implement through existing tools at their disposal to really make a difference for those families who are really feeling the pinch right now, and either cutting back on food, worrying about where that next meal will come from, in some cases going, entire days without eating. And I just want to stress on the why a little bit more, because, we also know that there's really long-term effects of food insecurity in terms of, children's development, in terms of people's health, in terms of people's ability to, build their own well-being. So the groceries and essentials benefit uses an existing tool that the federal government already has, the GST-HST credit, and we know that the federal government has looked to that tool before to create the grocery rebate, which was a one-time doubling of the GST-HST credit. But what it does is that it looks to substantially expand and restructure that credit. So it would look like $150 a month for adults, as well as a $50 supplement for children, which is a substantial increase in comparison to what people are getting now, which is a bit under $30 a month. And it would really be a lifeline for people to be able to afford groceries and other essentials. We know that food inflation, housing inflation has really far outpaced general inflation. And we don't expect, even when that moderates, even when inflation moderates, which we hope to see on the horizon, we don't expect that prices will drop. So we're still in this situation where, from a household budget perspective, people are spending a lot more on shelter costs, transport costs, essential costs, that is really untenable. Another feature of the groceries and essentials benefit is that it would be delivered directly through the tax system. So if people filed their taxes, they would get that money automatically. We're proposing that it would be distributed on a monthly basis, the way that we currently distribute the Canada Child Benefit, as well as the Guaranteed Income Supplement for seniors and the Old Age Security, to allow people to have some stability and be able to plan for the expenses that they have. And another feature of the recommendation is also that we know that there is a lot of barriers to tax filing for people with low income. Currently, there's estimates that say that $2 billion are left on the table federally for people who aren't accessing income supports through the tax system because they don't tax file, they don't know that they have to tax file. And we're encouraging the government to accelerate the commitment that's already been made to automatic tax filing to help connect more people to the income benefits that are available to them, and also to connect through networks of community organizations like the network that Prosper Canada works with to help connect more people to the supports needed to ensure that they're accessing all the income supports at their disposal.
And the benefit would be, it's a progressive model, so depending on your income, you'd make more or less tapping out at a certain level of income, right?
That's right. So the lowest income people would be eligible for $150 a month per adult with a $50 supplement for children, and about at the 25,000 income threshold, it would decline on a 5% taper.
Okay, thank you. Just shifting from food to housing, obviously housing is maybe the biggest policy topic that we've been looking at for the past year to 18 months, although people in the space have been looking at it for a lot longer. Over 1 million low-income or very low-income families live in unaffordable, overcrowded, uninhabitable, or inadequate housing. They require rent below $1,050 per month to afford other basic needs, and I think some of you might have seen the CMHC data from yesterday that showed like the average rent in Canada is now about $1,300. More than 230,000 Canadians are homeless. So the federal government got out of community housing about 3 decades ago, and there's a particular focus in the council's research on community housing. Yasmin, can you talk to us about non-market housing and the idea of home retrofits and what would be involved in some of those? That was one of the recommendations.
Yeah. Home retrofits are, a really critical nexus point of climate and affordability. And just to level set, give everybody Energy Efficiency 101. The structure and efficiency of a home has a direct impact on the amount of energy that home needs to heat or cool it. The more inefficient that house is, the more energy it's going to need to heat or cool that home, and the higher bills are. For lower income households across Canada, they tend to live in more inefficient homes. So they're already behind the 8 ball when it comes to efficiency. Energy efficiency is a proven and most affordable way to reduce consumption in homes. It puts money back in the pockets of Canadians, increases their resilience, increases the safety and the comfort of their home. And there are programs available. There are, greener homes programs, federal programs. The challenge for lower income households is that they need the capital and the cash flow to participate.
So you can't, you can apply to get your windows replaced, but there's a big cash outflow that has to happen at the outset, right?
Yes, if you're getting a heat pump, you need to have that $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 in your bank to be able to access it. And you'll get that $5,000, and that's a lot of money, but it doesn't cover the majority of those costs, right? You still need to be able to fund $15,000 on a heat pump or windows or insulation or air sealing. And so lower income households don't participate in these programs. The other option is financing, right? So we do have the Greener Homes financing a loan program that people can take advantage of. But as I said before, getting into more debt is not always the best solution for these families. And it is a financial privilege to go into more debt. And so what we are recommending when it comes to low-income retrofit programs is really an all-in solution, whereby the federal government would support communities to deliver deep energy retrofits that specifically improve the affordability of that home. And I want to talk about two specific aspects of this recommendation that are super important, because the devil is in the details with these programs. Things like cash flow are super important. So number one, these retrofits should be designed to improve affordability. And, I love heat pumps as much as the next person, and I've got my I Heart Heat Pump t-shirt too. But sometimes installing a heat pump in a home is not the first priority if we're looking to improve affordability. Well, maybe we want to spend that money on insulation and windows and air sealing. And they're not as sexy, but that's what that home needs. Every home is different. And so really making sure that that program is focusing on the affordability of that home in the upgrades. The second piece I want to talk about in terms of this recommendation is leveraging the work that's being done in the country already. And we really recommend that the federal government learn from the Greener Homes in terms of leveraging what's happening across the country. There's great things that are happening in BC and Alberta and PEI and Saskatchewan, communities on the ground that are really doing amazing work. And we encourage the federal government to lift those programs up. We would love for the federal government to get out of the program delivery sector. Let the people closest to the communities, closest to the problems, design and deliver those programs. I think the federal government can fuel the sector. They don't have to be the sector.
Some of the recommendations around housing also touch on their proximity to rapid transit. Can you talk about that aspect as well?
Yeah, I think transit is, as Nate, so astutely mentioned, that, housing and transit have to go hand in hand. A lot of folks really rely on transit as part of their life. And so making sure that transit and housing is together is really critical. And Nate, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I guess I'm glad that the federal ministry has actually combined both housing and infrastructure, which houses transit programs, in recognition of that fact. And those two things obviously need to go together, because, and we see actually tons of emissions reductions from building homes near transit, because it ends up changing people's travel behaviors significantly. So I'll just leave it there.
So on transit and transportation, another area where Canadians are finding it really hard to make ends meet, which Nate talked about earlier, but 1 million Canadians living in the biggest 8 cities are facing transport poverty. So that means that they just can't get around, can't afford to get around. Nate, what are some of the solutions the council's proposed for directly addressing that transport poverty?
So in urban areas, we sort of have two chunks, one on vehicles and one on public transit. And on the vehicle side, as I mentioned earlier, most low and middle income households, when they buy a car, they go to the used vehicle market. And from our perspective, we need to be tying that affordability and that climate lens together. So when we look at programs like the federal government's purchase incentive program for electric vehicles, it only applies to brand new vehicles, right? And so you're not actually touching the market that most low and middle income folks actually go to. And there's no income caps on it. There's been a lot of economic studies about this, but if you're high income and you're buying the price cap for a vehicle is like up $70,000, $80,000, that $5,000 credit isn't going to make a huge difference in your purchasing decision if you're very high income. So if you open up the program to high income folks, you're kind of just subsidizing existing purchasing decisions. If you tie it to income more closely, you're actually getting those folks who are on the fence, where that $5,000 can actually mean a bigger difference in your purchasing decision. So we've recommended putting an income cap on the program and boosting supports at the lower end of the income distribution and expanding it to the used vehicle market. At the same time, I think it's also important for all of us to recognize that a zero-emission vehicle isn't just one that has four wheels, right? So if you look globally, about 61% of all the 1.7 or so million barrels of oil a day that is being displaced by electric vehicles right now is e-bikes, scooters, mopeds, those kinds of vehicles. And those vehicles should have eligibility under this program as well, because they're already a much lower cost than a car. So that's another one of our recommendations on that side as well. On transit, the issue that we're facing right now is capital bias, where since the federal government did do its historic intervention and providing temporary operating support, it has stopped that. Only some provinces have continued. And what that has resulted in is we've spent or the federal government has spent about $23.5 billion on capital programs since 2016. Bus fleets have expanded quite a bit. The capacity to deliver more transit service, which is the primary driver of ridership growth, has increased significantly. But guess what? Cities who only collect less than 10% of all tax revenues can't actually afford to run all these extra services. So we see numbers like, according to Canadian Urban Transit Association fleet reporting data, we've got about 1,700 buses that could be in service right now that are sitting in garages as a result of both this capital bias and service cuts that happened during the pandemic, where, because of the lack of revenues, you're getting these service cuts as well. So this imbalance is really creating negative outcomes where, we need to be expanding services to these, especially suburban areas with poor, where folks are facing transport poverty. And at the same time, transit systems currently are not allowed to use federal money to directly improve transit service, to increase service frequency, to increase operating. They're not allowed to use any of the money towards that. And those are the core drivers of ridership growth. And at the same time, you're not allowed to use any of that money to make fares more affordable. So we've seen cities actually pass on a lot of these costs in higher fares that dramatically outpace inflation every single year, as far as the data goes back. So those are the two things that we're really talking about is we need to get the federal government to, it has changed its attitude towards public transit significantly since 2016. Before, nobody said, federal government, public transit, that's not your jurisdiction. But now, since 2016, we've had a long-term capital program. It's the first time that's ever happened. It's been transformative on the capital side of things. But because we have this one-foot-in approach, and without the operating side as well, we have these negative outcomes. So we need to be fixing that.
And just briefly, I wanted to touch on rural transportation, rural transit, because people in rural and remote parts of the country, people who live in Indigenous communities, there might not be a bus, an intercity bus that you can access. Rail service has been considerably diminished over the last, I'd say, about 15 years. there's a recommendation that touches on something called on-demand transit for helping people who live in more remote areas. Can you just talk briefly about that, Nate?
Yeah, so rural communities need obviously different solutions. On-demand transit works best in communities where they don't have the population density to really support fixed route transit. You end up really controlling costs and having folks really just with an app call a bus to their door so they can, like seniors can go to the community center, folks who are facing transport poverty can actually get around their communities. And there is a new program that launched in 2021, the Rural Transit Solutions Program, which really addresses this need. It's actually been a really important program. What our recommendations revolve around is kind of expanding its eligibility and the range of costs that it covers, because again, it also only covers capital costs when the main operating cost is the set driver's salary, really, and that's not, and these communities with very limited tax bases can't really support that. So there has been a bit of a limited uptake because of that. And as well, it's designed primarily to fit trips within a community and not a community to a larger urban center, where you have this, because of, for example, the pandemic and ridership that has fallen off a cliff for these private coach companies who have to turn a profit, they've just completely exited the market. All those services have just been slashed to the bone. It's very difficult to get anywhere really using private coach carriers these days. So having the government have a program where you can partner with municipalities to actually start providing those services would be a really good step in the right direction.
Thank you. Yasmin, there's one kind of, I think, base assumption in the report and the recommendations, which is that carbon pricing be maintained, which is a controversial topic in Canada right now. And there's, I think, a lot of Canadians that link carbon tax to their, why things are unaffordable. Can you talk about the rationale behind, keeping, having these initiatives, but keeping carbon pricing in place at the same time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the super easy softball question. Excuse me. Yes, first of all, I am not a tax economist. I work on the ground with people and really take a grassroots community-based approach to this. So that's my caveat. I would actually push back on that assumption that Canadians are looking at carbon tax as part of the unaffordability. I think politicians are certainly talking about it, but the folks that we work with and the folks that we help to support are trying to understand how they can reduce their energy bills, how they can make their home safer, how they can make them home more comfortable. And they're not super interested in tax policy, to be honest. And I think that carbon tax, especially when it comes to energy poverty and low-income energy efficiency, is a bit of a red herring, because we have had low-income Canadians living in energy inefficient homes for decades before the carbon tax came about. And that's why we have had low-income energy efficiency programs in Quebec since the 90s, because this phenomenon has been around and we've created solutions to address it. And so, when we have well-designed energy efficiency programs that put money back into people's pockets, that improve the comfort and safety and warmth of people's homes, that a well-designed program will achieve affordability. But as I said, the devil is in the details of these. You have to have a program that focuses on affordability to do that.
Can I just sit on that as well?
Go ahead, yeah.
I'll say that, I think it's really important not to see cuts to, for example, gasoline taxes or carbon taxes as part of an affordability solution, because what you end up doing then, you're just subsidizing the consumption of a carbon-intensive goods and services, right? When we need to recognize that prices are an important way of influencing people's behaviors, right? So if you're doing that, you end up locking in people for example, encouraging them to buy a more fuel inefficient car, where it locks them into this dependency on pretty volatile energy prices that are set by foreign OPEC countries, right? When instead, we should be focusing on, I think this has been the focus of the council, is instead of subsidizing the consumption of carbon intensive goods, it's about subsidizing people's incomes so they can afford to pay the bills. At the same time, subsidizing the costs of the greener alternative, so people can actually get off of this dependency on fossil fuels and really improve their households' budgets at the same time.
Thank you. Lisa, climate is contributing to affordability issues as well. Can you talk about that and the link between climate events and affordability?
Yeah, there's a lot of different things that are driving the increase in food prices, and further exploration and policy work to understand that better, to understand supply chains, to understand the global geopolitical dynamics that are affecting food prices, and certainly climate events we see now and expect to see more in the future will have an effect on food prices and inflation overall. So I think it's really important. I think Nate and Yasmin have both articulated this in different ways, but it's about looking at the overarching household budget and what at an individual or at a family level people are balancing, and ensuring that people have the financial flexibility to be able to make good choices that are going to help them in the long run to reduce their costs.
I notice that the report, the recommendations are all focused on one government, the federal government. Nate, is there a reason, why focus? Because a lot of these areas are in, you would argue in provincial jurisdictions. So why the decision to focus on federal levers?
Well, we are on the cusp of a federal budget. And we do believe that the federal government has an important role to play in addressing Canadians' affordability concerns, because that's the number one thing that Canadians are concerned about. And the federal government ought to be focused on the number one things that Canadians are concerned about. And what we're talking about here in our policy solutions are fundamentally really ready-made things that the federal government could just pick up and paste into a budget if they needed. Because we're talking fundamentally about programs that exist at the federal level, whether it's the Rural Transit Solutions Fund, the upcoming Permanent Public Transit Fund, the GST credit, which is being expanded, right? So these are all programs that are federal levers, and we're saying, look at these solutions. These are things that we can do today to address the concerns and the budget pressures that people are facing right now.
What I would add to that is that I think that in terms of the overarching ethos of what the council is trying to do, to have the federal government certainly, but also other governments think about all-in solutions, think about the dynamics of these pieces together, think about how we're forcing people to make trade-offs in their everyday lives to choose between buying groceries or paying the rent or paying a utility bill or making, a good choice for their financial future, which more and more people are not really in a position to be able to do, is fundamentally unfair. And these solutions in particular are off the shelf for the federal government, but I would say that the broader call to start thinking about policy solutions through that lens applies to all governments. And in particular, I would also say that there is a dynamic related to the groceries and essentials rebate where many provinces do not index their social assistance rates to inflation. And because of that, people have fallen further and further behind, and it is creating a particularly dire situation for people who are the lowest income. On the other side of that, I would also say that food insecurity is a pan-Canadian issue that Canadians in every province and territory are experiencing acutely right now in Indigenous communities, in single parent-led families, including people who are on social assistance as well as people who are working. So, an interesting finding from some work that's been done in food banks is that one of the largest increases in groups who has been using food banks are people who are employed. So it's not just a question of social assistance, is this federal or is this provincial? I think that there is a federal role here, but also a broader call to other governments to take some responsibility as well.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to pass it on to you in the room and to the people online. Thank you for tuning in. And Abigail, I'll give you my microphone. Abigail from the IRPP is going to come around with the microphone if you put your hand up. And Cléa, my colleague Cléa Desjardins is going to take. Les questions en français aussi sont bienvenues. Je pourrais toujours les traduire. So pour ceux qui sont en ligne, c'est la même chose. But I'll just ask one more question. Are there some good examples from other jurisdictions of similar kinds of programs, levers that have been pulled that have worked well?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I wish I had invented low-income energy efficiency programs, but no, there's lots available and there's lots of things happening. In Alberta specifically, there is a home upgrades program that is really the model of what we are trying to promote in the report. It provides deep energy retrofit programs, deep energy retrofits delivered by the community, supporting contractors specifically for affordability. And so that program could certainly be a model. And then I'd also point to our friends down south. They have had a weatherization assistance program across the United States for 40 years. And they have a huge sector and economy that drives that program. And then we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which offered $363 billion. 40% of that has to be spent in underserved communities and delivered by underserved communities. And those kind of details make a huge impact on the ground. So there's lots of examples, and we can write the playbook of how this is done for sure.
What's interesting about Canada is that we have lots of different interjurisdictional examples within our own walls, and Quebec is an interesting example. So Quebec has a stronger income security system than other provinces, and notably they also have the lowest rate of food insecurity nationally.
Yeah, I'll point to one at home and one internationally. In BC, they did introduce an e-bike rebate program, and I think it was so popular that it was oversubscribed in like 8 hours. So there's one thing. They've also recently put an income cap on their zero emission vehicle rebate program and expanded the amount given to lower income folks. Quebec and the United States also have it expanded to used vehicles. Internationally, I love to point to Paris. Since 1990, the share of trips that are done within the city of Paris by car has declined by 45%. The share of trips on transit is up 30%, and the share on bicycles is up 10 times. So, and this has been consistent since the 1990s with successive mayors, but it's been dramatically accelerated by Mayor Anne Hidalgo, and it's really been about reallocating city space away from cars and towards public and active transportation. And I think that's been a really inspiring transformation for Parisians.
Who doesn't want to talk about Paris, really? And I noted in Montreal that we've had some interesting changes too, with roads being converted into bike lanes and on Mount Royal, which has been interesting. So, anyone have some questions in the room? Abigail can come to you with the microphone.
We'll allow people on Zoom to ask first, and the folks in the room can formulate their questions. So I'm just going to start with a general question from Alison Mosowich. How are these messages making their way to policymakers, and how can everyday Canadians help raise them up? What can people do?
That's a great question. I mean, we are in Ottawa right now. We are making the rounds. We are connecting with as many policymakers as possible. I would encourage people to read the briefs, to share them, to talk about them, to elevate those ideas with people in their network, and to continue the dialogue.
And I would just add to that, to share the brief and your concerns with your elected official. I think all of us in the room know the power of that, but I think residents in Canada don't quite understand the impact that that can have. So, you know, pick up the phone, email that person, and they will meet with you.
Yeah, I'll say that it's one thing for us to be in Ottawa today and meeting with government officials, making our pitch. That's great. But what ends up making the big difference is they hear it from us, they're like, okay, you know, interesting. And then they go back to their office and they look at their email inbox and it's flooded with their constituents saying, hey, we want this too. Then it starts to click for them. So I think calling your MP, emailing your MP, sending them the PDF of our brief and say, hey, do this, you know, that'll be, I think, pretty worthwhile.
All right. Any question? Clea, anything else from the online audience? Oh, I see a question.
We'll go back and forth online and in person.
Wonderful. I saw your hand first, but if
Hello. Thank you very much for the conversation. I had a quick question around the groceries and essentials benefit. With the conversations around universal basic income, how does that, or has those conversations impacted some of the recommendations here, or how might that interplay with that if that does in fact become a reality?
I know that one's for me. Thank you for the question. The thinking of the council was really around what tools do we have at our disposal through our income security system right now? What levers does the federal government have available to them right now? We know it's a tool that they have used before, that in order to get money out quickly to people who are the lowest income and at the most risk of food insecurity. And we really came at it from that lens. I mean, certainly, you know, there's a broader conversation to be had about challenges in the income support system writ large, and we've seen different provinces start to test different models. You know, we also know that there's the commitment that the federal government has made to the new Canada Disability Benefit, which it will be forthcoming. And that will also, you know, help to fill a certain hole in the income security system. But it really wasn't the lens that the council was working through.
From Zoom, Nancy Chawan asks, what is the federal policy opportunity to incentivize financial lending institutions to do their part for affordable housing?
Oh my God, Nancy, jeez. You know, I think there are a lot of financial institutions that are trying to do the right thing. And I won't name drop them, but I think we can probably think of a few of them who are doing a lot of work when it comes to financial literacy, making sure that we're loaning money to folks who can repay it back, that we're not just, you know, giving loans to anybody because they want $50,000 to upgrade their home. And I would actually love to see the financial sector help educate program designers when it comes to home retrofit programs, because I think there's a little bit of a gap when it comes to how can we loan money to people responsibly to do these upgrades. So I would like to see some collaboration more. And there are folks out there doing it, but I think there's certainly some runway there.
I would also just take less so related to housing, but I think that there is a question that we should be asking related to, you know, and I have an opinion on this, if the financial sector is the right vehicle and actor to help low-income people build their financial health and well-being. Because low-income people, especially those who are receiving government benefits, you know, like banks and credit unions are not the experts in the intricacies of those programs and how they interact with each other and how different levels of income interact with each other. And really community-based organizations are the experts in that and have built up that expertise over a number of years in terms of specializing in what the dynamics are for household financial health for people on low income who are receiving government benefits. So I think that there's sort of a question there for me in terms of, you know, ensuring that the actors within that space, we're enabling the right actors who actually are the experts in understanding the challenges that people are facing on the ground.
It's collaboration, right? Coming together as a group, yeah, agreed.
My question is kind of follow-up to the conversation. When we combine these different institutions, financials, government, community, and nonprofit, can we have any successful story or example where financial institution might have created a product and nonprofit institution might have created an instrument to cover the risk so that they can leverage the capital they have?
One of the models that Prosper Canada has been looking at, that's sort of more broadly looking at financial health, is that there are some jurisdictions, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, where they have looked at a model where they are leveraging funds out of the financial sector, either voluntarily or through a tax, and then using those funds to reinvest in community services. So in the UK in particular, to support debt help and information about pensions, but also you know, their Citizens Advice Bureau, which is similar to Service Canada in some respects, but also provides sort of a wider array of government service navigation, also receives funding that way. Australia recently moved to a voluntary model of whereby financial institutions can pay into a fund as well as a broader suite of actors, and then that's reinvested back into community organizations in order to help build people with low incomes financial health and well-being.
One thing I'll say about how financial institutions can help this whole affordability conversation is labeling the climate action incentive properly when it's given back to people on their banking statements, because the fact that it's not labeled properly is like, it's one of the things that's fueling a lot of the disinformation out there, because most Canadians get more money back than they pay in the carbon tax.
Question from online. This is from Janet Baker, who's a senior policy analyst with the Ministry of Post-Secondary Education and Future Skills in BC. How does this cross-sectoral approach to policymaking in the context of affordability and climate change align with job creation and the push to meet labor market demand for specialized careers in the coming years? What skills and job training are needed to fulfill the demand for professionals to deal with the crises at hand?
So I'm just going to jump on the retrofit recommendation. To do retrofits in hundreds of thousands of homes, we're going to need a lot of people to help. And they're going to need to know how to swing hammers, how to put in insulation, how to install windows, how to air seal and install heat pumps. And the program I mentioned in Alberta, the Home Upgrades Program, is working with contractors, subcontractors to help them understand how, you know, building science 101, hiring them, engaging with them. And these programs are not successful unless you're hiring from the community. So hiring immigrants and newcomers and First Nations and Indigenous people to help deliver and design that program. You know, the benefits really are multi-solving. And so I think, there's lots of ways we can look at these programs, but it's climate, it's affordability, it's jobs, it's the economy. Yeah, that's my pitch.
Yeah, in terms of, from a labor perspective, I would say that one of the challenges that a lot of transit agencies are facing is labor shortages for bus drivers. So, that might end up slowing down service expansions when you really need it. And one of the barriers that we're facing is because of this lack of operating funding, a lot of times service is allocated mainly to the peaks. So like your 9 a.m., 5 p.m., when since the pandemic, the peaks have really flattened. People are commuting less. People are, and there's a lot of studies that have come out recently looking at the travel patterns of equity-seeking groups, and they tend to actually travel outside of the peak period, whether that's going to the grocery store. A lot of mostly women end up doing the household sustaining trips, as they call it, whether that's picking up kids from the daycare or what have you. They end up doing a lot more of the errands so that they travel in off-peak periods. Shift workers, disproportionately racialized, don't actually travel at 9 to 5. But the way service allocated is still, in a lot of cases, this 9 to 5 peak. And if you're a bus driver, that means you often get a shift for the morning and a shift for the evening, and you have an unpaid break in between where you have like literally nothing to do, and it really sucks. And because of it's a unionized workforce, so there is seniority, and that's obviously a good thing. But it means that the newer entrants are all stuck with these really bad shifts, so they're having a retention problem. So one of the things that operating funding would be great to do is not only to expand service outside of these peak periods to draw in those kinds of trips that currently aren't being served very well, kind of rebuild that ridership, but also give better shifts to bus drivers so we can retain more of them. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And did we have one more question in the room?
Hi, my question actually builds off the question that was just asked regarding the labor force. So I work for Build Force Canada, and our bread and butter is labor force data, labor market information for the Canadian construction and maintenance industry. And sort of a big elephant in the room when talking about housing and talking about green retrofits is labor. And a lot of people in this room are probably aware that our labor force is expected to decline about 20% in the next 10 years. And the last few years, data does not support youth, young Canadians, and newcomers joining the labor force. So we're actually in the process of wrapping up a couple of our annual reports on immigration, housing, residential, and green retrofits. And a lot of our modeling and data shows that we simply do not have the labor force to complete these projects. And never mind the, supplementary or additional targets that CMHC has recommended. And I'm wondering, from the perspective of affordability in this council, as we know historically, when things become scarce, like labor, it becomes more expensive. Especially in a country as vast as Canada, where we're trying to reach rural and remote areas as well to do these kinds of retrofits and build new housing. I'm wondering if the council has thought about labor in this context and how we bridge that gap and perhaps mitigate that potential other affordability crisis when it comes to labor.
I'll say this, building McMansions in sprawl communities is extremely labor inefficient. It's a lot more labor efficient to be building high density homes within cities, which is also a climate solution and an affordability solution. So one of the ways to tackle the labor shortage in the construction of homes is doing a lot less urban sprawl and doing a lot more intensification in our cities near transit. So I'll just say that.
Yeah, and to directly answer your question, we didn't specifically consider that, and certainly I think something that we will be looking at in the future. But I mentioned for low-income retrofit programs and hiring immigrants and newcomers. And I want to be clear that that's not just like something you can do. It's in order to be successful, you should do, you must do. It's a requirement, it's a best practice. And so there are apprenticeships, in Alberta, arguably, like that is one of the hardest places to do that type of work, but it's happening. We're shifting the workforce from folks who have the ability to swing hammers into homes doing these retrofits. And what we've seen with that program is that at first when we launched, the subcontractors were really suspicious. They were like, what do you mean? We're gonna just upgrade low-income households, and what's the catch? What do we have to pay? And then when it's the real deal. And as they started working with us, they really got on board with it. They're doing good work, doing good things for folks. They're not building McMansions. They're helping some people who are down on their luck have a more comfortable home. And so now they are the biggest proponents of that program. They've really bought into that program and the impact it can have.
I just want to say thank you for that question, because I think you demonstrated the complexity of all of the policy questions that we're talking about, which are inextricably intertwined. And I'll just say at the IRPP, we have embarked on a major research project on workforce transformation, which is another element. So we have labor shortages in some areas, and then some people who will be transitioning into different kinds of labor because of the labor that they're doing currently is not going to be there. So I think it's just another reason why we cannot talk about anything in complete isolation. So I really appreciate that question. And Clea, I guess we have time for one more from online? Yeah.
We have time for one more question from online, where we've had over 900 people register for the Zoom element. So thank you for tuning in. So our final question here, and we encourage everyone to please, in the room, stick around, ask your questions to our panelists in person, have a bite to eat with us. So final question is from Gillian Ames, who asks, with all these different supplements, why not just push for universal basic income?
I feel like it's the same question that I'm going to come at again. And again, like a big impetus and motivator for the work of the council was, what is something off the shelf that we feel that the federal government could implement in some form in this current budget that would have a meaningful impact in the lives of people with low income who are struggling to put good food on the table. There is a much larger conversation to be had about the complexities of the income security system in Canada writ large, but in terms of an off-the-shelf immediate solution that people could tangibly feel in the short term, we felt that the groceries and essentials rebate was something quick and easy that the federal government could run with.
If not this budget, maybe the next or the next. But I will say to Gillian, just talking again about the collaborative exercise that we had as a group, it's sometimes hard to come to common ground. UBI is an area that is, there's not a huge, I would say, a Canadian consensus around it. And in fact, our institute published a book on basic income that came out last year, which actually is not in favor of it for well laid out reasons. So, I think it's maybe an area where there wouldn't have been complete agreement around the table of experts that we had. Which sometimes happens when you're dealing with complex issues. So thank you for those excellent questions. Merci d'être venu aujourd'hui. J'aimerais saluer et remercier notre panel, Yasmin, Lisa, and Nate. Thank you so much.
Jennifer.
And I want to thank the founding partners of this council, the Trottier Family Foundation, the McConnell Foundation. We have friends from the McConnell Foundation here today, Destination Zero, and the IRPP. And I'll just say, because I can, thank you to my colleagues at the Institute who are here and helped organize the event today, Clea, Abigail, Rosanna, who was instrumental in helping put the report together, Shaima, and Francis, I think I got all the names there. Thank you to all of you, and please stick around. There's some food and beverages, and we'd love to chat with you some more. Thank you.